As the first rays of sunlight spilled over the vast plantations, the enslaved individuals of America stirred from their meager slumber on dirt floors. Another grueling day awaited them, stretching from sunrise to sunset, filled with relentless labor under the watchful eye of a looming figure, the overseer. This overseer, a haunting presence, could embody various personas, cold and indifferent, a strictly professional supervisor, or a loose canon of cruelty and gratuitous violence. For the enslaved people in the antebellum era, living with hostility and unpredictability was their daily reality. The future that lay ahead for the enslaved people of America was a dark chapter in history that we can hardly bear to confront, one marked by stolen autonomy, exploited bodies, tore apart families, robbed childhoods, and shattered dreams. Welcome to Time Capsule, where today we delve into the distressing reality of what slave breeding entailed. The farms. Amidst the growing awareness of the inhumanity of slavery, the breeding farms emerged as arguably the darkest chapter in its history. The world began to condemn the practice, driven by both humanitarian concerns and economic factors. However, for the United States, a nation heavily reliant on the labor of its enslaved population, change seemed an impossible proposition. With approximately 1.5 million slaves around 1820, the backbone of the American economy relied on their brutal exploitation in the production of lucrative exports like tobacco, cotton, rice, and sugar. Although the international slave trade had become an abomination, the United States clung to its invaluable asset. The cunning plantation owners devised a new strategy: internal slave breeding. By creating an internal market for slaves, the antebellum economy could maintain its strength and sustain its growth. In just 4 decades, the enslaved population skyrocketed from around 1.5 million to a staggering 4 million, with the largest breeding farms situated in Maryland and Richmond, Virginia, ensuring a steady supply of slave stock throughout the Deep South. The decision to resort to breeding slaves internally had legal implications. In Britain, led by figures like Wilberforce and other Christian groups, an abolitionist charge influenced the British Parliament to pass the Slave Trade Act in 1807, effectively ending the Atlantic slave trade. Concurrently, the United States was experiencing an unprecedented agrarian expansion, with the cotton gin revolutionizing cotton production, westward expansion claiming new territories, and no signs of slowing in sugarcane and rice production. Under international pressure to abandon the slave trade, the US passed a law to prohibit the importation of slaves, effective from January 1, 1808. Following the footsteps of their British counterparts, the United States ceased plundering African lives to enslave them in the West. However, rather than abolishing the practice of slavery itself, the country devised a sinister alternative: the grim business of natural increase through breeding. The plantations. Life on a plantation in the United States was an appalling ordeal, systematically stripping any semblance of dignity and humanity from those trapped in its brutal grasp. Yet, within this nightmarish reality, the experiences of enslaved individuals varied, influenced by a myriad of factors. For many, to be a slave on a plantation meant relentless toil under the sun, working the fields from sunrise till sunset for 6 long days out of 7. The promise of food was far from guaranteed, and when provided, its quality could be so abysmal that it barely sustained them, akin to sustenance fit for animals. However, on smaller, struggling farms, some slaves might not even receive the meager rations they so desperately needed to survive. Living conditions were equally grim, confined to meager shacks that often offered nothing more than a dirt floor and no semblance of furniture or comfort. The threat of violence loomed constantly, most frequently wielded through the hands of the overseers, a group responsible for maintaining the oppressive master-slave dynamic on the plantations. On larger plantations, overseers were a terrifying presence and became the subjects of countless horror stories from the antebellum era. Their primary objective was to extract maximum labor from the enslaved workforce, for which they were compensated. To achieve this, overseers resorted to almost any means they deemed necessary, often descending into cruelty and violence, exacerbated by alcohol-fueled outbursts. Regardless of their background, few overseers lasted more than a few years in their roles, surprisingly due to a threshold for cruelty even within this dehumanizing operation. Masters saw their slaves as valuable property, and any overseer deemed too vicious with their laborers risked being dismissed by their employers. Drivers. In the twisted hierarchy of slavery, the role of a driver epitomized the self-perpetuating morbidity of the system. These drivers were individuals entrusted with responsibilities similar to overseers, but with a horrifying twist. They too were slaves. Yes, on the plantations of the US Antebellum era, masters would often handpick a slave from their own ranks and grant them authority over their fellow captives. This added yet another nightmarish layer to the already grotesque dynamic of master and slave. As a driver, an enslaved individual would receive conflicting messages. On one hand, the master would dangle the promise of better privileges if the driver could extract more labor from their fellow slaves. However, being favored by the master did not necessarily translate to earning the trust and respect of their fellow enslaved individuals. Historical accounts reveal that drivers were often despised by their fellow slaves, yet, paradoxically, they were a more enduring and relatively popular figure compared to overseers. Despite the near impossible nature of their task, drivers would hold their positions for decades and, in some cases, prove more adept at managing plantations than overseers. This, however, does not negate or dismiss the fact that a driver was most likely still deeply loathed by their fellow slaves. The voices of those who suffered. In the haunting accounts of slave narratives from the antebellum period in the United States, a chilling reality emerges: the pervasive cruelty of forced mating. Within the confines of slavery, the very notion of consent was obliterated, replaced with a harrowing landscape of assault, rape, and coerced relations. The perpetrators of these heinous acts were not limited to slave masters alone. Their sons and overseers were equally guilty of inflicting unspeakable horrors upon the enslaved individuals under their dominion. This dark chapter of history reveals a disturbing trend: the rise of arranged marriages and forced mating, all driven by a sinister objective: to increase the slave stock. As Franklin Frazier aptly expounded in his renowned works, slaves were reduced to the status of mere livestock, subjected to a dehumanizing reality that extended even to their mating practices. The grim story of Mary Stenhouse, among others, casts a shadow over this era. It speaks of stockmen, enslaved men subjected to degrading practices, reminiscent of livestock breeding. These unfortunate men were weighed and tested, akin to animals, before being confined in a room with women handpicked by plantation owners for breeding purposes. This grotesque system reduced men to bucks and women to breeders, stripping the latter of any agency over their own bodies. It was a nightmarish reality where women were forced into unwanted sexual encounters, leaving them utterly powerless to refuse. The lives of these breeding women were marked by horror and suffering. They were carefully selected for their breeding period, often commencing from tragically young ages. For these young women, childbirth practically began in their own childhoods. Accounts recount women as young as 22 already having given birth to 7 children, or others aged merely 19, burdened with 4 offspring. Their existence was tragically reduced to a cycle of repeated rape, enduring pregnancies in poverty, and giving birth in the unforgiving fields. Shockingly, they were then expected to conceive again within an impossibly short span of just 2 to 3 months. The breeding women were robbed of their bodies, their children, and their very lives, subjected to indignities that history books often dare not recount. The silence surrounding these atrocities must be shattered, for these stories are a testament to the unimaginable suffering endured during one of humanity's darkest periods, the era of American slavery. In our pursuit of truth and empathy, Time Capsule confronts the painful realities of the past, seeking to shed light on the untold stories and experiences of those whose voices have long been silenced. Thanks for watching the video, and if you found it informative, please like and subscribe to Time Capsule for similar content. We look forward to sharing more knowledge with you in the future. Until then, take care.